At the same time that both Kennedy and Johnson dealt with the gradually escalating conflict overseas in Vietnam, the continuous Cold War with the Soviet Union, and growing sectional division within their own party, various groups within the United States demanded increased civil rights for better education, access to voting, and equal representation before the law. And lest we attempt to divorce these issues from those on the global stage, the Black, Latinx, Indigenous, white, men, women, and LGBTQ plus communities who sued and protested and marched in the 60s did so for complex reasons that often intertwined with issues of anti-communism and decolonization. Because after all, the authority structures that colonized nations sought to overthrow in the post-World War II era were often very similar to, if not the same as, the governments and authorities that these groups saw as their own oppressors, although some certainly more than others. And so when we look at civil rights in the 60s, we need to keep a broad focus, not only seeing these movements as connected to each other, but as connected to larger events unfolding around the people involved in them. When it comes to the Black community and the fight for civil rights in the 60s, what we're looking at is really a huge period of transition. At the start of the 60s, there's still very much a push for desegregation coming out of the Brown versus Board decision. And so you've got organizations like the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, which was founded in the 40s, that's pushing for desegregation through things like sit-ins. But they're also increasing the scope to include voter registration, because the first roadblock to preventing African Americans across the country, but especially in the South, from voting is preventing them from registering to vote. And so in the early 60s, desegregation and voter registration becomes sort of the cornerstone of CORE's activism. But then added to CORE, we also see the emergence of organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which is committed deeply to this idea of nonviolent civil disobedient protest. And then as an offshoot of that in 1960 is the creation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Ella Baker didn't start the SNCC because she necessarily disagreed with the philosophies or goals of the SCLC or CORE, but because she was tired of the male-dominated leadership of those organizations and their tendency to make decisions at the top and then dictate those decisions down to people who actually had to carry them out. She wanted the SNCC, or SNCC as it was actually called, to have room to debate and disagree. And so at the turn of the decade, these organizations, CORE, the SCLC, and SNCC, dominated the more or less nonviolent aspect of the African American civil rights movement. In 1961, CORE organized a series of bus rides across the South to challenge segregation laws. It was important that these freedom rides, as they were called, be interstate as to draw the attention and legal interaction of the Interstate Commerce Commission. In theory, the ICC should be able to regulate interstate travel and enforce integrated transportation, even in the South. The first group made it to Alabama before their bus was firebombed, and those who escaped were beaten by the KKK, who had chased the bus out of town in the first place. Ultimately, Bobby Kennedy, President Kennedy's brother and the Attorney General, sends federal marshals to escort some of these groups. Politically speaking, this move was dangerous since Kennedy needed the support of Southern Democrats for both his legislative agenda and eventually re-election. But at this point, the U.S. faced bigger problems than our own politicians. The Soviet Union saw the disturbances and violence against African Americans and activists in the South and used that as fodder for anti-American propaganda. After all, how could a nation that didn't allow most of its own citizens to vote claim to be a beacon of democracy for the world? Protests against segregated transportation continued throughout 1961 and 1962, in addition to sit-ins and boycotts at restaurants and lunch counters, hotels, and other businesses orchestrated by CORE and the SNCC. And then in 1963, several high-profile events changed the trajectory of the movement at large. In April and May, activists actively challenged the racist laws in Birmingham, Alabama, held in place by Police Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor and the executive authority of segregationist Governor George Wallace. After weeks of peaceful protests on May 3rd, Connor unleashed attack dogs on the protesters, men, women, and children as young as elementary school age, sprayed them with high-pressure fire hoses, and called on police officers to beat them with clubs. About 3 weeks before this, Dr. Martin Luther King sat in a Birmingham jail solitary confinement cell, writing a scathing letter to the moderate white clergy of Birmingham and any other part of the nation, who said that he was being too radical in his approach to civil rights. In the eyes of moderate whites, King was an outsider, a man who wasn't from Alabama and didn't understand their way of life. In a scathing response to their calls for patience, one that wouldn't be published until weeks after the incident in May, he reminded them, quote, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in direct action that was well-timed in the view of those who have not suffered from segregation. For years I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has always meant never. We must come to see that justice too long delayed is justice denied." The violent reaction to the Birmingham demonstrations began a gradual, heavy emphasis on gradual, shift in the overall African American civil rights movement. Black Americans involved in the protests in Birmingham and other cities and watching from home started questioning the validity of Dr. King's strictly nonviolent tactics on a much wider basis. After all, some people, even within the SNCC, CORE, NAACP, and SCLC, had questioned these tactics from the start. Nonviolence had never been the way the Black community protected itself in the face of serious danger, especially not in the Deep South. That had almost universally been done through armed resistance. And so to be told in the 50s and early 60s that suddenly nonviolent civil disobedience was going to create change was actually a huge change to the status quo and the very fundamentals of the way many of the movement's on-the-ground leaders were raised. And so when the Black Power movement arose as an alternative vision for the movement in the early to mid-60s, advocating that African Americans should use whatever tools at their disposal to stand up against racism and police brutality, the message was an appealing one to many activists tired of getting beaten for their beliefs all the time. So what we see is a sort of gradual shift and fracturing happening that's really obvious to see in the planning and execution of the March on Washington, not only for the Black activists, but for the government as well. So we know that this is the event where MLK gives his "I Have a Dream" speech, which was actually preceded by a ton of important information about unemployment that always gets forgotten. But there were also other speakers here that are important and sometimes get forgotten. The late Senator John Lewis, for example, spoke as a leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he was actually told by the event's organizers that he needed to tone down his speech because it was too radical, because it was speaking too angrily about issues like police brutality and other topics related to the Black Power movement. But perhaps even more important than the speech given were the ones not given, by the women who did arguably the most work in the movement and received the least recognition. The women who faced the most oppression as members of an oppressed race and gender, but were barred from speaking by an organization dominated by clergymen dedicated to upholding conservative gender roles in leadership. We'll return to these women in a moment. Ultimately, what the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom did accomplish was actual civil rights legislation, though. President Kennedy saw the shifts happening within the civil rights movement and the growing influence of the Black Power movement and considered the idea that perhaps if a civil rights bill were passed and actual change happened, it might tone down the movement. This idea was short-lived. On September 15th, the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham was bombed, killing 4 young girls during their Sunday school class. Even the most devoted proponents of nonviolent civil disobedience took to the streets in outrage and grief, where Birmingham police proceeded to kill 2 additional teenage boys. Of the nearly 24 bombings to happen in Birmingham over the course of the last decade, the FBI failed to bring charges in a single case. After Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, President Johnson did bring the Civil Rights Act before Congress with the message that they should pass the bill before them because it was what Kennedy would have wanted, that they should honor his memory by passing the legislation that he would have wanted to see go through. And in the spirit of the moment, they did. But it didn't have the intended effect of quelling the civil rights movement. If that moment ever existed, it was gone by 1964. One of the keys to the shift happening within the African American civil rights movement was gender dynamics. For well over a century, women had been central to the activism in the Black community, but never seen as true leaders in the cause. Respectability politics almost always placed Anna Julia Cooper, Fannie B. Williams, and Mary Church Terrell at odds with movement men like Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. In the modern civil rights era, a similar clash put movement women at odds with the mostly conservative male leadership of organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the NAACP. Ella Baker created the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1960 out of a fierce discontent for the top-down, male-centered leadership of other organizations. In 1962, Fannie Lou Hamer used information she picked up at a SNCC meeting to become one of the few African Americans to successfully register to vote in Mississippi. She was later beaten excessively by the police for her participation in voter registration drives and workshops, leaving her with permanent scars. In 1964, she addressed the Democratic National Convention in a televised committee hearing as a representative of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. She also ran for Congress to challenge the long-held seat of white congressmen in her district, although the Democratic Party refused to put her name on the official ballot. Activist and lawyer Pauli Murray coined the term Jane Crow as the double oppression faced by black women. As a black feminist scholar, Dr. Brittany Cooper writes in her book Beyond Respectability, Murray experienced this firsthand as a college student at Howard University, which is doubly interesting when one remembers that Howard is a historically black college. She didn't coin Jane Crow as a commentary on her race. It was a commentary on the gender dynamics experienced by black women relegated to inferior positions because of their womanhood. In her own case, she faced even further oppression as what we would now identify as a transgender individual. Pauli Murray was hospitalized at several points in her early life for bouts of depression, during which she adamantly insisted that she was male. But for the remainder of her life, she identified as a woman while using feminist organizations to push for anti-sex discrimination and reconcile her own process of becoming a woman. Murray also pushed back against the male-dominated sphere of the 60s civil rights movement at the March on Washington, as one of the more vocal opponents of the fact that literally not a single woman was asked to give a speech at the event. But discrimination against women wasn't the only gender dynamic at play when it comes to division within the African American civil rights movement. Black men as well struggled with the concept of nonviolence as a tool for activism, especially in the face of such brutal violence against their homes, communities, and families. Dr. King's message of strict nonviolence and civil disobedience in the face of blatant harassment by white racists and the KKK was a change from what many, especially in the Deep South, were accustomed to believing about protection and change. Nonviolent tactics and the beatings that often came with them also tended to leave many men feeling a sense of emasculation. Nobody wants to go out to call for change only to be met time after time with beatings and told that they can't fight back. And so the Black Power movement's call for men, especially to stand up for their community and stand up to police brutality, found a welcome audience among a lot of these men who had spent years of their lives patiently trying other tactics without success. A real turning point in the movement on a national scale for those involved and even white people at home who really had little exposure to what was going on was the Selma March in 1965. Organizers from the SCLC, led by Hosea Williams, and SNCC, led by John Lewis, began an over 50-mile march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, to protest the state's resistance to comply with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In theory, the law was meant to blanketly prohibit discrimination in spaces open to the public, even privately owned spaces like movie theaters, restaurants, and hospitals, but authorities in Alabama simply refused to enforce it. When marchers reached the bottom of the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, they were brutally attacked by police and state troopers who used tear gas, bullwhips, clubs, and horses to take down the protesters. Over 50, including John Lewis, had to be hospitalized. The event that brought this into most people's homes was the decision by ABC Network to cut into their regularly scheduled evening programming with footage that they'd taken of the march and the police brutality. For the first time, really large numbers of white American families across the nation, not just the South, saw the intensity of violence aimed at peaceful protesters. This isn't to say that millions of white Americans suddenly jumped off their couches and joined in the protests, not even a little, but in the sense that Selma caused Americans to at least ponder the circumstances of people beyond their own enclave of influence, it was a turning point. Bloody Sunday, as it became known, was also the catalyst for Congress to push through a voting rights bill, which passed as part of Johnson's Great Society legislation in 1965. At a march in 1966, SNCC leader Stokely Carmichael got up and gave a speech where he said, quote, "We've been saying freedom now for 6 years and we ain't got nothing. What we gotta start saying now is Black Power," which led to a roaring response from those in the audience. It also led to a massive response from the NAACP, conservative black leadership, and the media. because until this point, the SNCC had stayed more or less in line with the status quo of nonviolence and patient suffering. And for many, calls for Black Power were quite the opposite of that. The Black Power movement started long before the 60s, long before anyone around in the 60s was born, or even really before their parents were born, because the idea of Black Power came out of larger ideas that have existed since abolitionism and the writings of Frederick Douglass. On a sort of foundational level, Black Power was about ensuring that African Americans were able to take part in their rightful share of privileges as citizens of this nation, including voting and running for office, economic success, and educational opportunities. Beyond that, different people had really very different ideas of exactly what those things meant, that often varied based on age, gender, economic status, religion, and regional differences. When we look at it more practically, though, some obvious leaders of Black Power come to mind. As a leader within the Nation of Islam, founded in Detroit in the 1930s, Malcolm X paralleled Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the sense of using religion as the drawing force for his following. The Nation of Islam's teachings differed considerably from that of the Christian Church, though, emphasizing the inherent superiority of global Black community over white people and the need to protect Black institutions, languages, and families from white influence. These ideological and theological differences also led to practical differences in how they perceived the movement as a whole. Whereas Malcolm X and other Black Power advocates didn't believe in turning the other cheek in the face of direct violence, the clergymen of Dr. King's community and the SCLC reverted back to traditional Christian philosophies of suffering as a virtue, as demonstrated by Jesus and Paul in the Bible. And so a lot of the practical differences that we see between the ways that these two high-profile men approached the movement had a lot to do not just with politics, but with their firmly held religious convictions. And to be fair, both of these men understood this about each other. Both knew that the reasons for their differences were complex and that their end goals for the movement weren't necessarily the same. In truth, Dr. King didn't have a problem with the Black Power movement's goals. By 1966, his own philosophies, while still deeply rooted in nonviolence, were also aimed largely at things like ensuring that African Americans could use their right to vote to actually produce change, to elect Black leaders throughout the South, and especially in predominantly Black communities that had seen white politicians in power for decades. He also spoke out famously against the conflict in Vietnam, explaining disparities in the draft that also disproportionately affected poor and Black communities, but also questioning the rationale of sending troops overseas to fight a poor country in the name of communism, which preys on the poor. And then he helped organize the Poor People's Campaign as his focus shifted more towards solving issues rooted in poverty and economic injustice, both issues similarly championed by the Black Power movement. And so ideologically, Dr. King really had little issue with the ideas inherent to Black Power. Where his problem lied was the name itself, the slogan that he believed the media and even the Black community used to take what he considered to be very complicated issues and boil them down to just that, a slogan. He also refused to believe the negativity inherent in the slogan and what it represented in his opinion. In commenting on it, he said, quote, "It is, at bottom, the view that American society is so hopelessly corrupt and enmeshed in evil that there is no possibility of salvation from within." In his mind, the idea of Black Power was too close to the idea of Black nationalism, of Marcus Garvey and those who previously thought that they just had to separate from the United States entirely. Dr. King still held out hope that there was something in the relationship between the Black and white communities to be salvaged, some genuine white reformers who were there for the good of the Black community. Others were not so sure. In critiquing King's methods, Stokely Carmichael said, quote, "In order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience. The United States has none." He also argued that Black Power was, quote, "a call for Black people to begin to define their own goals, to lead their own organizations, and to support those organizations. It's a call to reject the racist institutions and values of this society." And increasingly, that's what people did. Even going back a bit to 1964, people just like Stokely Carmichael and SNCC were using the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to try and elect Black officials to local and state offices, people like Fannie Lou Hamer. And then in 1965, they created the Lowndes County Freedom Organization in Alabama to organize a voting registration drive, since 80% of the county's population was black, but literally all of the government officials were white. The organization adopted the symbol of the Black Panther because when a panther is backed into a corner and has nowhere else to go, it isn't afraid to give everything it has to fight. This local party didn't last long, but it did inspire two California natives, Huey Newton and Bobby Steele, to organize a party of their own. The Black Panther Party that came out of Oakland in the early 60s focused a lot on black leadership within the black community, cultural pride and education, calls for an end to economic exploitation in lending and housing, better health care, and end to police brutality. To achieve many of these means, and understanding that a lot of what they were calling for was wildly unpopular with moderate and conservative whites, they were also rampant supporters of the Second Amendment. After all, if white men could brandish guns whenever and wherever they pleased for the sake of protection, why couldn't black men? And so much of the public image of the Black Panther Party is that of their uniform: leather jackets, black berets with weapons. But a keynote to the Black Panther Party agenda was really what they call survival programs, what in other times might be called uplift. These survival programs included things like the People's Free Food Program, better known as the Free Breakfast Program, blood drives and other health clinics, services to take elderly people to doctor's appointments, nutrition and hygiene workshops, especially for expectant mothers, and mentoring programs for young boys like you see here on the right. They also included a lot of the programs that would be necessary for children to be successful at school: vision tests, vaccine clinics, clothing drives, and free busing. And where children and even adults didn't learn about black history at school, community members stepped up to fill in the gaps, ensuring that growing young black men and women understood the context of the movement that they were living in. In many ways, this almost socialist approach to the survival programs bordered on ideas of black nationalism, total insulation away from the white community in favor of self-sufficiency. But at the same time, the Black Panther Party's endgame, at least initially as part of the Black Power movement, was necessarily to go outside of just the black community and inundate mainstream politics. As an organization, it couldn't survive in both the conservative and liberal extremes. The Panthers also struggled against internal divisions, as women, who outnumbered men in the party by the early 70s, complained of the ultra-conservative gender roles, similar to the Young Lords in the same time period. This led them to create their own auxiliary Black Panther Party. By the mid-70s, both local and federal police violence aimed at the Panthers, as well as internal divisions, left the organization a shadow of its former self. But this wasn't the only arena where people took on the call to challenge and reject racist institutions. In 1964, heavyweight boxing champion Muhammad Ali, formerly Cassius Clay, openly affirmed his conversion to the Nation of Islam. 3 years later, he famously refused to be inducted into the army to fight in Vietnam. When asked about his decision, he remarked, quote, "Why should they ask me to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam, while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights? No, I'm not going to go 10,000 miles from home to help murder and burn another poor nation simply to continue the domination of white slave masters of the darker people the world over. This is the day when such evils must come to an end. I have been warned that to take such a stand would cost me millions of dollars, but I've said it once and I'll say it again. The real enemy of my people is here. I will not disgrace my religion, my people, or myself becoming a tool to enslave those who are fighting for their own justice, freedom, and equality. If I thought the war was going to bring freedom and equality to 22 million of my people, they wouldn't have to draft me. I'd join tomorrow. I have nothing to lose by standing up for my beliefs. So I'll go to jail. So what? We've been in jail for 400 years. In June 1967, Ali was convicted of draft evasion, banned from boxing for 3 years, and fined $10,000. He managed to stay out of jail during the appeals process, and ultimately the Supreme Court overturned his conviction in 1971, 3 months after the very first loss of his boxing career. He wasn't the only athlete to put his career on the line to make a statement, though. At the 1968 Olympics, runners Tommy Smith and John Carlos, the gold and bronze medal winners, raised their fists during the U.S. national anthem, a gesture that's commonly referred to today as the Black Power salute. John Carlos attended my alma mater for a period when he was in college and came to talk to the history department students about his experience with racism in East Texas, which the area is notorious for, hence why the school also shows up as the depiction of racism in Disney's Glory Road. He even wrote a chapter about his experiences on the university's track team in his biography. But more importantly, what I learned from listening to his talk was that in that moment in 1968, the message that he and Tommie Smith were conveying wasn't just solidarity for African Americans in the United States. It was a much more global message than that. They were speaking to larger messages of Pan-Africanism, global injustices in places like Vietnam, and the kinds of oppression that placed black and brown athletes in the Olympic Games and other sporting events for decades before that as spectacles or measurements against white people rather than as testaments to their own ability. And so in that moment, which John Carlos described as so quiet that for a few seconds you could honestly hear a frog piss on cotton, he and Tommie Smith joined in a long line of black athletes and performers who used their platform to make a statement about the injustices perpetrated against their community. The same stand taken by vaudeville performers in the mid to late 19th century, jazz and blues performers at the Harlem Renaissance, Jack Johnson, Joe Louis, Jackie Robinson, Willie Mays, and so many others like Colin Kaepernick and Venus and Serena Williams. At the same time as the movement for African American civil rights was a call for new definitions of femininity and a reevaluation of gender roles for women. The reasons for this movement varied and differed depending on the women involved, but sort of collectively, they can be summed up as a general sense of dissatisfaction for women's gender roles in the post-World War II era, interactions with and involvements in the African American civil rights movement, a general sexual revolution during that time, especially with the introduction of the birth control pill in 1960, and a strong and dynamic leadership to hold the movement and its varying interests together. These were some of those leaders. Betty Friedan and Pauli Murray were co-founders of the National Organization for Women, or NOW, which we'll come back to in a second. Friedan was also known pretty widely for her book, The Feminine Mystique, which spoke a lot to the general dissatisfaction of women in the United States. So when you think of something that's got a sense of mystique, there's usually a sense of mystery there, the general quality of something that's shrouded in a bit of secrecy, something we don't quite understand. So the feminine mystique, then, is something that we perhaps thought that we understood but don't. And in the very beginning of the book, Friedan explains it like this. She says, quote, "Each suburban wife struggles with it alone. As she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night, she was afraid to even ask herself the silent question, is this all?" And so the idea here is that women have spent the better part of the last decade or the post-World War II era staying at home and raising families and taking care of the household because that's what they were told to do. That's what the magazines told them to do. That's what their parents told them to do. And that's what the pressures of conformity told them to do. In fact, when you think about the consumer products we looked at in the 50s, that's what most of those advertisements and stuff told them that they should want to do. But now that we've got a lot of women, although to be fair, not all women, who are looking at this lifestyle where they do literally the same thing day in and day out, and they look at themselves at the end of the day and ask if this is all that there is to their lives. They're seeking a sense of fulfillment. And this is an incredibly gendered notion and moment because for essentially the entirety of American history, we've worked under the assumption that people in the United States should always try to better themselves, that they should increase their intellect, go into the unknown and conquer something new. But what women learn in the 50s and early 60s, not necessarily for the first time, but for their first time, is that this vision for Americans is for American men. Men in the United States can go out and conquer the world and be adventurous because they know that they will have something to come back to because women are there doing the boring daily work of making things run. And so the remainder of the feminine mystique is really an answer to this question, is this all? Explaining to women why under the current system of things, this is all and will always be all by default, and why things need to change. And so Betty Friedan and Pauli Murray, who we talked about before in the African American Civil Rights Movement, work with other women to create the National Organization for Women, or NOW, which is a really great title of an organization when you think about it, because they can go out on the picket line or go marching, and when somebody says, "We want change, when do we want it?" everyone else screams, "Now!" Really just brilliant. But anyway, their platform has three major components to it: equal pay for equal work, the legislation of safe abortions, and the passing of the Equal Rights Amendment. The first concept here is pretty simple. Women think that if a man and a woman are working the same job with the same requirements and are equally qualified, they should receive the same pay for that job. At this point, there was no law saying that companies couldn't just pay women less because they were women, and so companies did this all the time under the breadwinner logic, or the idea that men should be paid more because they were, in theory, the people whose income paid for family expenses. But this logic simply didn't account for the complexity of the vast majority of family situations in the US, and never has really, so they wanted to change it. Their second issue was the legalization of abortions, or women's right to choose. To be very clear, abortion has existed as long as birth, which what they're looking for here is the ability to seek an abortion from a medical doctor instead of someone who will sell weird herbs in an alley or a random kit in the mail that women can use to do it at home and probably die from complications. It's also true that wealthy women could secure medically safe abortions essentially this whole time because they had access to private physicians. And so what the women here are protesting for is the same right for all women that wealthy white women have had this entire time. The third thing on their agenda is the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. This is actually not new, like not even a little. The ERA was put before Congress in 1923. It reads, "Equality of rights under the law should not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. The Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article." So it's literally 2 sentences. And in literally every congressional session after 1923, women introduced the amendment again and again and again. But it didn't really make any progress until the 70s, which we'll discuss when we get there because it's a whole thing. So these are the main goals of NOW. In addition to co-founding NOW with Betty Friedan and other women, Polly Murray was an advocate in the LGBTQ+ community, the first Black woman ordained as an Episcopal priest, and a member of Kennedy's Commission on the Status of Women. As an attorney, she advocated for women by using the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause to argue that discrimination shouldn't be racist or gender-based. As a woman intersecting multiple movements, she was a champion for all women. She used the power she had to create change for women as a Black woman with open lesbian relationships in a time when the hierarchy of change was cisgender, straight, male, and Protestant. She wasn't the only one who knew how to fight against this hierarchy, though. In the South and West, agricultural workers, many part of the Bracero program, faced extremely dangerous labor conditions every day. No bathroom or lunch breaks, 10 to 12-hour days, water from a communal rusty container, and people as young as babies and as old as grandparents in the fields. And because of the labor contracts negotiated with these workers and their tentative immigration status, many had no say in their conditions. Dolores Huerta, who had already done local community organizing to help the students at the high school where she taught, was a perfect fit for organizing these workers. She and fellow organizer Cesar Chavez created the United Farm Workers of America, later the UFW, which used the same ideas of nonviolent civil disobedience as Dr. King's civil rights campaigns. In 1965, she led the Delano grape boycott and the settlement that came out of it with the grape company. During that period, she came into contact with other feminist leaders and decided to shift her focus more to the needs of the women in her community who had always been on the front lines there with the men and children in the fields and strikes because they were double laborers in the field and in the home. And then last we have Shirley Chisholm, who was the first African-American woman elected to Congress in 1968. Of the bills that she sponsored during her time in Congress, over a quarter were education-oriented. She also sponsored a bill to prohibit public use of the Black Hills for 10 years so that it could be restored to the Lakota, Dakota, Sioux tribes for religious purposes during that time. In 1971, she co-founded the National Women's Political Caucus, which helps identify women leaders who want to run for office and helps train them for that process and what it will look like and the realities of what the job will entail. It also helps connect them to sources of funding, which is arguably the number one thing that stands in the way of candidates in the offices they're running for. And so even beyond her time, Chisholm promoted the participation of women in politics and the furthering of women's issues on the national stage. When it comes to legal gains for women as a result of the feminist movement, we can see some of the major ones here. Many of these were goals of the National Organization for Women. Some were policies that came out of other legislation which benefited women by their nature. And another one that isn't actually on here is the start of the term Ms. to address women. We might attribute this to Gloria Steinem and her publication Ms. Magazine, which she first published in December of 1971. In addition to publishing feminist issues about women's concerns, things like mental health, physical and sexual health, breaking down political news that apply to women, and giving practical and everyday advice, the magazine also popularized the term Ms. itself. It brought to the forefront the idea that women didn't have to be identified by their marital status. They didn't have to be a Miss or a Mrs. They could be defined by any number of the other things that make up who they were: their intellect, their passions, their talents. And so if a woman didn't want to be defined by their marriage, either for social reasons or perhaps because she was afraid that it would damage her somehow at work, she might go by Ms. instead. Today, as a rule of thumb, if someone doesn't know if a woman is married or not, Ms. is always a great way to address her, unless they're at a college, in which doctor or professor is the best way to go until told otherwise. But let's take a closer look at some of these. Established in 1961, affirmative action was created as a means of increasing access to jobs and education for minority groups. A lot of times today we think of this in terms of quota systems, but that's actually really not how affirmative action works at all. There's no law or rule that says that schools, universities, or jobs have to create certain quotas for any minority group. What the executive order created by President Kennedy says is that people receiving money from the federal government must take affirmative action to ensure that equal opportunity is provided in all aspects of their employment. This applies to race, color, gender, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and national origin. So what this means is that these companies, schools, and other organizations, what they have to do is look at applicants either for a slot in a program or a job and evaluate them based on factors that would create equity in these areas. So for example, one of the ways that we see this in job applications today is that a lot of applications ask for either a college degree or a certain number of years of practical experience. This is a way of ensuring that the company gets a great candidate, no matter if that candidate had the money to attend college or not. Because as we all know, or should learn at some point, practical job experience can be infinitely more valuable than classroom experience in a lot of cases. So when looking at two candidates, one who went to college and one who spent 5 years actively doing the job you're hiring for somewhere else, one might be equally qualified despite coming from very different socioeconomic backgrounds. This is one way of creating equity. We'll talk about this again later, but we're talking about it here because the number one beneficiary of affirmative action and affirmative action programs aren't any particular racial minority, it's white women. If you look at the chart here, you can see the general trend of women's college attendance over time versus men's college attendance. The different shades of red, pink indicate different levels of education: bachelor's, master's, and doctorate degrees. Over time, you'll notice that these degrees collectively rise for women. They also collectively go down for men for reasons that have a lot to do with the fact that many of the jobs available to men don't necessarily require college degrees. But due to scholarships, admissions requirements, SAT requirements that require additional tutoring, and a plethora of other factors, the primary benefactors of affirmative action when it comes to affirmative action are women. So the same goes for the workforce. When faced with the idea of needing to create a more equitable workforce, employers hire white women, the lesser of evils, if you will. This isn't to say that these women didn't work hard or weren't deserving of these degrees or jobs, but white women, especially Southern white women, absolutely must understand that even within the feminist movement, they hold an incredible position of privilege. The same goes for the Equal Pay Act, which was passed in 1963 and prohibited unequal pay according to gender. As you can see from the cartoon, for every dollar or buck the man made, a white woman made 59 cents. The purpose of the Equal Pay Act was to correct this disparity. But this obviously doesn't take into account that minority women were paid significantly less than this. Remember that ever since the New Deal, most labor legislation that guaranteed minimum wages often neglected specific industries that included minority communities, agriculture and domestic labor being just some examples. Here we can see how this plays out in a more modern context. Comparing men's and women's salaries in 2016, there's a pretty substantial difference in the medians in a lot of our nation's larger cities. Even just narrowing it down to cities in Texas, El Paso has a difference of nearly $9,000, Fort Worth has a difference of over $7,000, and Austin has a difference of over $6,000. So what accounts for this difference if we're supposed to be paying men and women the same amount for the same work? Part of the answer is that men and women aren't doing the same work. In 2016, there were 21 women leading Fortune 500 companies, just over 4%. In 2020, there are 37, or just over 7%. When it comes to the managerial positions that pay more money, women are simply overlooked for the positions. And the reasons why tend to be the same that we see in politics. The idea that women are too emotional to handle big decisions, or questions about what about her family, or accusations that she isn't very likable. Other parts of this may have to do with the types of industries that women work in, which lead to lower pay. For years, STEM fields promoted gendered notions of male domination that were off-putting to women, but these are the fields that tend to pay the most. On the flip side, college-educated women are often pushed into fields like education that rarely pay a livable wage and increasingly desire a second degree that put people into debt without any foreseeable payout. There are a multitude of other factors that contribute, but these are some of the bigger ones. And then more broadly, we have Title IX, which prohibits sexual discrimination in facilities funded by the federal government. Now, Title IX covers a wide range of things today, like sexual harassment on college campuses, for example. But what it's most widely known for in a lot of circles is actually sports. So one of the things that Title IX did when it was passed in '72 was essentially say that there needed to be equity in access to sports for male and female athletes. And this might seem like a really ridiculous thing for the government to be dictating, but when you think about it, in college, sports equate to scholarships. So if we're out here saying that we want to create equal opportunities for people to be able to access college regardless of things like race and gender, one of the major sticking points was that there was only like one women's sport for every like 3 men's sports in high school or college. And so by default, that means that there were less scholarship opportunities for women. So now in the fall, when we have football, we also have volleyball, baseball, and softball, men's and women's soccer, basketball, tennis, track, cross country, and a whole host of other sports. If you look at our chart here of the number of student athletes over time, you'll notice that despite the passage of Title IX, the numbers don't exactly balance out. This also makes sense, because if you think about it, there are like 10 billion dudes, maybe not exactly, I'm not a football person, on a football team versus considerably less women on the volleyball team. So this isn't an exact science, but it's meant to provide equitable opportunities as much as it can, because like so many other things in all of our movements towards civil rights, it's not a points system. It's about access and equal opportunities. We've already touched on this a bit with Dolores Huerta, but let's look at the Chicano movement as a movement on its own here. The Chicano movement wanted equal rights and opportunities for Americans of Mexican descent. Part of this movement centered in the agriculture and labor sector, where labor leaders like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta used tactics of civil disobedience typical of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to organize workers into a labor union, the United Farm Workers. In 1965, Huerta joined forces with Filipino grape growers to organize a nationwide boycott on Delano table grapes, which lasted until 1970 when they reached an agreement for better conditions. In 1966, the Chicano movement began facing a lot of the same issues as the movement for African American civil rights in terms of radicalization within the movement. Within the movement, Mexican American men exhibited a gender identity culture of what's called machismo, this idea of manliness and sort of aggressive or dominant male pride. And so the idea of men taking part in nonviolent civil disobedience, especially in the face of dehumanizing brutality and violence, wasn't really a natural thing. This is really similar to what we see within the African American civil rights movement around the same time. So in '66, Cesar Chavez leads a march from Delano to Sacramento, California, nearly 350 miles, to demand real legal changes from the governor. And in addition to bringing national attention to their cause and the grape boycott that's already happening, this march gives members of the movement something actionable to do other than just peaceful labor strikes. But the governor isn't super responsive to them, and by 1968, the radical parts of the movement are more radical in calling for an end to the nonviolent aspects of their movement. They want to be able to strike back when attacked and be more forceful in their work. And Chavez is having none of this, so he starts going on a hunger strike for pretty much the entire month of February, taking in nothing but water. It's not until Senator Bobby Kennedy, who you'll recall as former Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, shows up to listen to them and talk with the governor while kicking off his campaign for presidency, that Chavez ends his fast. But it's not just laborers who are part of this movement. In the same year, 1968, Chicano students in East LA staged a walkout because they were tired of their school curriculum teaching nothing but old white dude history and literature. They wanted the things that they were learning in school to reflect the community that they actually lived in. The students were also tired of being told that they should aim for less, shouldn't hope to go to college, should really focus on getting a job or family skills, while white students were being signed up for SAT prep classes and counseled on college and career path options. In part, they also wanted to emphasize the use of the term Chicano as a reclamation of their cultural identity, although today many prefer the term Latino or Latinx. This cultural reclamation was also profoundly visible in things like the Chicano mural movement, where local artists created murals celebrating the local history of Mexican and indigenous people who originally owned and inhabited the lands of the South and the West. What we see in all of these movements are a common thread of two things: the desire for equal access to the full rights and privileges that the Constitution grants all Americans, and the opportunity to use those privileges to create a better future for oneself and one's family. What happens in the long decade of the 1960s is that with dynamic leadership and divisive issues on the international stage, the question of how to go about doing these things becomes a question of debate. And with so many Americans and categories of intersecting interests when it comes to civil rights issues, those debates are often complex and require leaders to work together or make difficult decisions to exclude one another at the expense of collective growth.